Hey, before we dive right in, I just want to take a quick second to talk to you directly. This podcast exists because of community, because of international parents here in the Netherlands. We are all navigating systems that were not built for us in mind, and in a language that's not ours, and in a country that, well, doesn't always make it easy. And that can feel incredibly isolating. Today's episode is one of those, in case of emergency, break glass kind of important. It's really important because it's also practical. And honestly, it might be exactly what someone in your life needs to hear right now. So here's my ask. Share the episode. Drop it in the WhatsApp, post it in your Facebook, send it to the colleague who just told you she's expecting, or a friend who's been quietly worrying about their rights at work. Knowledge is the ultimate baby shower gift. Be that person for someone. Okay, let's get into it. Welcome back to the Damn Parenting Podcast. I am your host, Eva, and I'm happy you're here because, well, if you're listening, it really means you're looking for answers somewhere other than the Facebook groups, with answers that usually begin with, when I was pregnant, or I heard it happened to this lady. Well, let's talk about being pregnant in the Netherlands. The Dutch system here, bless its organised bicycle riding heart, it's quite good. I mean, there are real legal protections. There's real paid leave. There's real legal rights, but it assumes you already know how it works. And if you're an international, maybe you moved here 2 years ago or 8 years ago, maybe your Dutch is still limited to ordering biertjes and saying lekker. Well, the system hasn't exactly rolled out the welcome mat of explanations. And so what happens? Well, people can panic. They post in Reddit at 11 o'clock at night asking strangers for legal advice. They go to work feeling sick, wondering if they're allowed to call in. They don't know if their temporary contract means they're going to lose everything. And they don't know if their medical appointments during pregnancy should be paid. They really, truly have no idea. And that's not their fault. That's a gap. This episode is an updated version of one of the very first episodes this podcast ever made, because things change. The law moves, new rules come in, and the questions in the Facebook groups, the WhatsApp chats, the Reddit, well, they have never stopped. So what better thing to do than to come right back to it properly and with a specialist? Today's goal is simple. Cut through the confusion, reduce the unnecessary anxiety, and let you get back to doing what you should be focusing on, being pregnant. Hopefully some of the time, most of the time actually enjoying it. I'm joined by Ferline van Laerhoven, an employment lawyer, founder of the Ferline Law, and someone who has made it her entire professional mission to make sure that pregnant employees and new parents in the Netherlands know their rights. Ferline, welcome to Damn Parenting.
Thank you. And thank you for having me. It's really nice to be able to talk about my work for this audience. So my name is Ferline and I'm a Dutch employment law specialist. I've been working for international companies and international employees for about a decade. And last year I founded Ferline Law, through which I help employees, but also companies throughout their journey from pregnancy to parenthood. So all the questions that they come across, maternity leaves, unequal treatment situations for the company's policies, how does it work, what are the rights of the pregnant employees, any questions that pop up I help these clients to go through this.
Can I actually ask you, what would be like a common thing you see international parents get completely wrong about their rights here in the Netherlands?
I think some of the rights during the pregnancy. So most know that they have maternity leave, of course, but during the pregnancy, you also have rights like extra additional paid breaks. We get to that later, I think, in the podcast. But if your pregnancy requires it, you have rights to extra breaks or deviations in your workload, or if you have physical work, there are options to adjust this during your pregnancy. I think that is something that is not commonly known. And also when returning to your job after your pregnancy, that you have a right to return to your own job and that there cannot be any changes in your position or in your pay or in your hours without the consent from the employee. I think those are the points that usually are unknown.
Let's actually just go where most people really start. That terrifying moment when you're pregnant and the question hanging in the air is really, do I have to tell my boss or when do I have to tell them? Because this is going to cause a lot of anxiety. So is someone legally required to tell their employer they're pregnant, first off?
Well, eventually, yes.
So what's the deadline?
You have quite some time. So legally, you have to tell your employer 3 weeks before you start taking your maternity leave. And in the Netherlands, you can take this 6 weeks prior to your expected due date. You have to go on maternity leave 4 weeks before the expected due date. So you can, be about 7 months, but most employees, of course, tell their employers earlier. Usually also see that you're pregnant, and it's important to tell them earlier for everything that is needed to be arranged.
And does actually telling your employer earlier, is there any legal protection benefits from it?
Yes and no. So the protection you have against dismissal also already applies when they do not know that you're pregnant. It even applies when you yourself do not know you're pregnant yet. But for other things, it is important to have them know, because if you need any adjustments for your work, or if, for example, night shifts, you're not required to have night shifts or to work night shifts. And of course, they will have to know that you were pregnant in order for you to claim these rights. So yes, it is important to inform them upfront so that you can actually tell them you want to make use of these rights because you were pregnant.
And for those of us who have been very anxious in pregnancy and we're not really ready to share the news yet, what about if the employer suspects you're pregnant? Are they actually allowed to ask?
No, they may not. No. So you do not have to answer that question if it is asked. This also is also applicable and also important, for example, when you're not employed yet, but are searching for a job and you're in the interview phase. During interviews, they also may not ask you if you are pregnant.
Now, let's talk a little bit about actual working environments, because being pregnant is not always just about paperwork. It's also a physical experience. And I think a lot of people don't realize how much their employer is actually obligated to do. What workplace adjustments are Dutch employers legally required to provide for pregnant employees?
Yeah, so it also depends, of course, what your job is asking from you. Some people have very physical jobs, so there the adjustments that need to be made could be much bigger than if you work at an office. But it could be if you standing, lifting, so heavy work, but also night shifts, working overtime. Those are all possible adjustments need to be made. So night shifts and overtime are not required when pregnant. And if you have restraints, or your company doctor also tells you that you have to take it a little bit slower, it is important that adjustments are made so that you can have a safe working environment during your pregnancy. And this also in my introduction, the additional paid breaks. So 1/8 of your workday. So if you work 8 hours, it would be 1 hour. You can ask to have that as an additional paid break, to take that rest, like 50 minutes somewhere during the day, 50 minutes somewhere else during your pregnancy.
So this is the legal requirement to provide extra rest breaks.
Yes, that is a legal requirement. And a lot of people don't know it. And I think also, you have to be honest, if you don't need it, well, I wouldn't ask for it, but it could, of course, be that some weeks or some days, and also the nausea, that's something that is very, very common, especially in the first trimester, that employees just want a little bit of a slower start in the morning. They could ask for that extra additional paid leave to be, at the beginning of the day, that they start a little bit later, and that way they can manage their day a little bit better.
Leading on, because pregnancy, as you say, can make you feel a bit unwell, especially the first trimester. And a lot of people really don't know that being sick during pregnancy is treated differently from regular sick leave. So let's get into this part. So if someone is actually too sick to work because of pregnancy, so you have severe morning sickness or complications, or maybe you're on bed rest, is it treated the same as normal sick leave, or is it different?
It also depends a little bit on your contract, but normally when you're sick, you have a continued payment of 70% of your salary, unless this is contractually different or by collective labor agreement. But if your sickness is related to pregnancy, you always have a right to 100% payment of your salary. So that is a significant difference, and something that you have to look into if you are sick and your sickness is related to pregnancy.
And this is something I've read a little bit about now, probably a lot more than I would have anticipated. But if someone is signed off sick during their pregnancy, does that actually eat into the maternity leave, or how does it differentiate there?
Yes, so when you are sick during your maternity leave, and you've started your maternity leave 6 weeks before your expected due date, then nothing changes in the duration of your maternity leave. But if you plan to go on maternity leave 4 weeks before the expected due date, and you do become sick prior to the 4 weeks, so within the 6 weeks and the 4 weeks, the flexibility period, in that case, those sick days are seen as maternity leave, and they are subtracted from the period after you've given birth. So it's a little bit complex, and I always have to write it down to understand it. So if you have that situation, it's always good to double check if your maternity leave is calculated the right way, or ask for advice with your HR, for example.
And during pregnancy-related sick leave, who's paying? The employer, the UWV? Is it full salary or 70%?
So in that case, it depends if your sickness is related to pregnancy or not. So if it's not, if you have a broken arm or broken leg and you're pregnant, it doesn't make a difference and you fall back on your contractual sickness payment, so to say. If your sickness is related to pregnancy, then you always get the 100% payment. And then the employer could ask for reimbursement at the UWV, the Employee Insurance Agency. First, you have to check if the sickness is related to pregnancy or not.
Okay. And can the employer pressure someone who is signed off sick during pregnancy to come back to work at all?
No. So when you're sick, that's the general rules of sickness in the Netherlands are always regulated also with a company doctor. So in that case, company doctor would need to see the employee and the advice of the company doctor is leading. So if they say that employee cannot return or return for just a couple of hours or start reintegrating, that is the final say and they have to follow it. Or if you have an option to ask for a second opinion somewhere else, but a company doctor is normally the one leading in the advice.
And can I ask, after giving birth and if you're on maternity leave and you become unwell through either physical or mental illness, if you end up with PPD, PPA or something else, what happens at the end of maternity leave if someone is still unwell and they're actually supposed to return to work?
Well, when you're not able to return to work after your maternity leave has come to an end, you call in sick. And again, the company doctor will be the one to advise on possible reintegration or a prolonged period of sickness before returning to work.
Let's talk about the actual leave itself, I guess, because there are a lot of moving parts here when it comes to it, I guess. So there's timing and paperwork and, well, what happens when things don't really go to plan. Can you walk us through how the 16 weeks actually work? I mean, how it's split between the before and the after and how much flexibility there is?
Yes. So in Dutch, we call it zwangerschapsverlof and bevallingsverlof. So giving birth leave and pregnancy leave. But for now in this podcast, I will call it maternity leave before or after giving birth to the child. So you have 16 weeks in total. And as I mentioned before, you can go on leave 6 weeks before the expected due dates, but you have to go on leave 4 weeks before the expected due date. And depending on when you choose to go on leave, the remaining part of the 16 weeks will be afterwards. So that would be the maternity leave after giving birth. You always have a right to 16 weeks. It cannot become shorter. It can, in some circumstances, become longer. And that is the case if you, for example, take the 6 weeks upfront and your child is born after the expected due date. You could have in total a longer period than 16 weeks. And that is because you always need to have a minimum of 10 weeks after giving birth. So 16 weeks is something that is fixed, and the 10 weeks after giving birth is something that is fixed. So in that way, there is a possibility if your child is born in week 41 that you have, in fact, 17 weeks of total maternity leave.
That's good to hear. And on that note, if someone's baby comes early and they haven't used all their pre-birth leave, what happens to those weeks?
Yes, they are then moved to the bevallingsverlof leave. So you keep having a right on these 16 weeks. So if your child is born earlier, then your maternity leave before becomes maternity leave after.
And to apply for this maternity leave, what do we have to do? Who do we have to apply for? Is there a form? And how long do we have to give them notice?
This is something that is organized by the employer. So what you do need to do when you tell your employer that you're pregnant is also give the certificate of your midwife or from the hospital to prove that you are pregnant. And the expected due date is also written on that statement. And with that, the maternity leave is requested from the UWV.
And what happens if the baby arrives very early, like premature and maybe even hospitalized in the NICU? How does that affect the maternity leave clock?
So honestly, this is a very specific situation. And if the baby is hospitalized or not, or for a longer period or not, could make the leave longer. But it's very on a one-to-one basis. You have to know that there might be additional rights to longer leave. So it's important to ask your employer or the UWV how this works in your specific situation.
And now going into another element of being very individualized because everyone has something different, it's the contracts. So there's permanent and temporary, and then there's part-times and ZZPs. So let's look at permanent. If someone has a permanent contract, what does that mean for their job security when they're pregnant or on leave?
Yes. So when you have a fixed or an indefinite contract, that is of course, the best contract you can have while being pregnant, because you are protected against dismissal. So during your pregnancy, during your maternity leave, but also 6 weeks after returning from maternity leave. So that is protection that goes on even beyond the 16 weeks of leave. And during that time, there are no options, or well, in general, no options to dismiss the pregnant employee.
And what if your contract is temporary and it even ends while you're pregnant or while you're on leave? Do you lose all the rights?
Yes, so when you have a temporary contract, by operation of law, so to say, that the contract will end. The company does not have to give a reason for not renewing the contract. And in that case, even while you're pregnant or while you on maternity leave, your contract will stop. And at that moment, you will receive compensation from the UWV for your maternity leave period. So you are still financially covered, but you are unemployed and will need to search for a new job. However, in the case that you were promised a contract renewal and you have the idea that the contract is now not being renewed because of your pregnancy, it is important to be very alert at that stage, because it could be that they are treating you unequally, a form of discrimination, because they're now not renewing it anymore, even though they had promised it. In that case, it is important to also seek legal advice to see if there is an option to either reclaim your contract so that the contract will be renewed, or claim a compensation.
And when we look at part-time work, does the 16 weeks change, or is it just the same as everyone else?
It is the same as everyone else, yes.
Short and sweet.
Yeah.
So freelancers then, this is a huge topic. Can you give us a brief overview? How does maternity leave actually work for someone who has no employer?
Yeah, so when you're a cessataire, you still have a right to 16 weeks of maternity leave, but there are a lot of different nuances in comparison to when you have an employer. So it could be an entire new episode to talk about your rights as a cessataire in the Netherlands, in regards to payment, what to do, how it works.
Okay, noted. Episode potential there for the future if anyone wants that. I want to go somewhere that doesn't always usually get covered, but I really think it needs to, because pregnancy loss happens. And when it does, the last thing anyone should have to navigate alone is the legal rights. So what are someone's legal rights if they experience a miscarriage, and what does the Dutch law actually say?
With a miscarriage, yes, that's a very situation you don't want to be in. In some situations, of course, the miscarriage can be in such an early stage that your employer did not even know you were pregnant. Sometimes it's at a later stage and your company is aware. So that is already a nuance, I think, that is important, because when having a miscarriage and your employer is not aware, there's, of course, the option to tell them and to see what the options are to get some time off, to go through it. And if they are aware, then of course it's a little bit easier to discuss the options, because by law, if the miscarriage is before the 24 weeks, there is nothing regulated in the law to receive any form of leave. So normally often an employee is calls in sick to get the time to process it and to recover. Also here, it could be that your contract or your policy or a collective labor agreement does have forms of leave that they apply in such cases, but it is also important to inform your company that you're going through this.
And last year there was a petition that was brought up in front of the government because they gathered enough signatures to be able to apply the grievance policy, basically, that was, as you say, from 24 weeks, that they were trying to make it inclusive for miscarriages at any stage. I heard Amsterdam initially just put it straight into policy here, and then Utrecht has followed shortly after. Is that something that we know anything more about that we can address here?
Well, at this point of time, I have not heard that other cities have followed or companies, specific companies, but there are, of course, as I mentioned, collective labor agreements that often give more than the legal standard. So this is, of course, something that is now initiated, and the big cities, are taking the lead here. And hopefully other cities, but mostly other companies, are going to follow in their footsteps, because it's, of course, very important that even if you have a miscarriage before 24 24 weeks, it's very odd to have this line at 24 weeks that you either get 16 weeks of maternity leave or get nothing. And I can imagine that a miscarriage at 5 weeks is different than a miscarriage at 23 weeks, but it would be great if it's regulated a little bit better, that you can actually ask for a certain leave that is provided for by the company.
And then continuing on with that, what changes legally if a pregnancy ends after 24 weeks or ends up with a stillbirth?
Yes, in that case, the 16 weeks remain the same, the 16 weeks of maternity leave. So legally, after 24 weeks, your stillbirth or your pregnancy, your born child, is considered the same as if you were to give birth on 36 or 40 weeks. So that makes it a legal birth in that sense.
And is there any separate bereavement leave for pregnancy loss on top of sick leave or maternity rights? Or does everything just fold into the category of maternity?
Yes, it all falls into the category of maternity, at least by law. But again, here, if your company policies or your collective labor agreement say otherwise, it could be that you have additional leave for the bereavement. And it is, of course, a very sensitive topic and very emotional topic. So always have this discussion with your employer to see what is possible, because often employers also prefer you not being out on sick leave, but perhaps they give you some time off to process this situation, and they are able to give you some type of other leave instead.
Is there currently anything in Dutch law that protects someone from dismissal or negative treatment at work after a pregnancy loss?
Not so much as the protection you get when you are pregnant or enjoying your maternity leave for the 6 weeks after. There is not an article in the law which gives you that protection. However, there are articles in the law where you have to act reasonably as an employer or as an act of good employership. That's how we call it. And if you are dismissed after a miscarriage or a stillbirth, and you can prove that this is connected to that, of course, you do have a ground to claim compensation on the basis of that article.
Okay, moving on. Let's talk about when things aren't really going right due to documentation and how that goes. Because knowing your rights in theory is one thing, but knowing what to actually do when an employer steps over the line is actually another thing entirely. So, what are the most common ways employers, even genuine, well-intentioned ones, accidentally get things wrong?
Yes, that's a good question, because I think there are a lot of employers who might treat a pregnant employee or someone returning to work unequally due to lack of knowledge. That is one thing. They don't know the exact rights, so therefore they are just making decisions, and they do not know that they are perhaps treating someone unequally on the basis of the law. And other things, another example that I wanted to raise is that they might even think that they are doing the right thing. So what I hear a lot in my practice is that they could, for example, say, "Oh, you've just become a parent and you have so much going on at home, and therefore we think that this training that we wanted to enroll you into, or this promotion that was promised to you, it might not be a good time at this moment to do that because you have a newborn at home." And even though that might be from a genuine thought or idea that they have, it can still be unequal treatment, because if that promotion was promised to you and you still want to do that, it is not up to them to point out that it might not be the correct timing.
And if someone is actually trying to build a case, for example, like keeping records because they feel like something's wrong, what documentation should they be gathering from day one?
I think any meeting notes that you have with your manager or with HR about your performance, that is very important. But also, if you've been working at a company for a longer period of time, could be performance improvement plans, positive reviews that you have, maybe just emails where they mention, "Okay, yeah, you're doing really well. We are thinking about this promotion," or anything with compliments about how you're fulfilling your job are very important to gather. At the moment, they might not be renewing your contract or withholding a promotion for you. And also policies, usually, or sometimes you can trace them very easily on the internet, or it has been sent to you, but always make a copy of the policies, because there might be relevant information in there for your case as well. And it, of course, also depends on your case, what you need. But those are things that are good to gather and have.
And if someone wants to formally challenge how they've been treated, what is the timeline for filing a complaint and where do they go?
That's a very specific question, but with a very broad answer, I think, or very, it really depends on the situation. So in some cases, you would need to go to court. For example, if you are dismissed during your probationary period and you have the feeling that it is related to your pregnancy, at that moment, you have 2 months after the termination of your contract to ask for an annulment of the dismissal at the district court. So it's a very short time. And this 2 months come back quite regularly in different scenarios. But for some other things, for the promotion, there's not really a time frame. And there I would say the moment that happens, to take action as soon as possible. Because if you leave it for a long time, it might also be seen as sort of acceptance of a decision that was made. And it's good to follow up rapidly in that case.
Okay.
But it depends on the situation.
And well, honestly, when I think of lawyers and legal stuff, it just means a lot of money to me. Are there free advisory bodies or resources here in the Netherlands that our international parents could access?
Yes and no. Well, there's a lot of information online, lots of free information, but the difficulty there is that it might not be up to date anymore. Also, ChatGPT is used a lot, of course, lately, but also there it's very important to know that the Dutch law does change. Jurisprudence or case law makes the answers different throughout time as well. So be careful with that, but you can find a lot through midwives. They might have a lot of information to access. Juridisch Loket, that's something in the Netherlands that gives access to free information that is hopefully also checked, which I think it is. And sometimes also for advisory, you can turn to the Juridisch Loket, but it also depends on the income you have. So for low income employees, they can give free advice. But if your income is too high, you will be referred to other legal specialists to assist you.
So if someone out there is feeling something's not right, they're feeling they're being treated differently because of their pregnancy, what are the first practical steps they should be taking?
Yes, my advice would be to gather the information, as we discussed in one of the questions before, so that you actually have everything documented and at hand. And the next step I would take is to discuss it with your manager, because sometimes, or quite often, it could also be a misinterpretation, miscommunication, a lack of knowledge, as I mentioned earlier, that the company doesn't know that they are treating you unequally. So have this conversation, because if you would reach out to a legal specialist right away, you could also escalate the situation. So have this conversation, but do not give in. So it's more that you point out what is bothering you or what decision had which emotional or other effect on you, and really listen to their answer and make sure to make notes or ask for notes. And that from there, if you still feel that you need to take more action, you can take it further. I would first have the discussion and be transparent about how it affects you.
Okay, this has been quite a long episode, but I just have a very quick one. This is one people always ask.
Go ahead.
Can you quickly walk us through what our partners, the non-birthing partners, are entitled to?
Yes, so fortunately, partners here in the Netherlands have received a little bit more time to spend with their newborns. In the past, it was only 2 days after birth, and now it is 6 weeks in total. The first week is against full payment, but needs to be taken within the first 4 weeks after birth. And after that, they have 5 weeks that they can take and needs to be taken within the 6 months after birth. And these 5 weeks are paid at a lower rate, so it's 70% of the last earned salary. A good side note also in regards to maternity leave that we discussed earlier in this episode is that when you receive 100% or the 70%, it is important to note that if your income is higher than the maximum daily wage, that it is capped at a certain point. So it could be that you receive less income during your leave than you are used to, but that really depends on the height of your salary.
Good to know. So this is a huge topic. So we're going to just round this up here with just one question. Wait for it, listeners. But if you had just had one piece of advice to give to an international parent who just found out they're pregnant and have no idea where to start, what would it be?
Yes. So if you just found out that you're pregnant, you're of course very excited about everything and full of questions. But important to know is that in the Netherlands, you are well protected. There are various laws that protect you against unequal treatment, various forms of leave, as we discussed during this episode. And we've got your back. And should you have any questions during this first period of your pregnancy, you can also always turn to me.
And speaking of which, how do we find you?
You can find me through Instagram, LinkedIn. I have my own website, so www.ferlinelaw.nl, which is in Dutch and in English. My Instagram page is also in Dutch and English, and LinkedIn as well. You can find my phone number there as well. Email address is info@ferlinelaw.nl, and I would be very happy to talk to you with any questions you might have related to pregnancy and work in the Netherlands.
Ferline, thank you so much, genuinely. And what about those partners questions that we had just now? And we only had one question there. Well, we are delighted to have Ferline come back to us again to discuss the partners aspect of maternity and paternity leave. If you have any questions, why don't you head over to Instagram, Spotify, or just hit us up with an email at damnparentingpodcast@gmail.com, and we might be able to add in your question to the episode. Thank you again, Ferline, for joining us here on Damn Parenting Podcast.